Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on decoding sufficient clinical evidence under EU MDR for medical devices. First minute or so here we'll give to allow everyone to join the room here. As that's happening, on the right side of the screen here, you'll see that there's a chat. Go ahead and drop in there. We always like to get a sense of where people are calling in from, so I'll go ahead and drop in where I'm calling in from. I'm calling in from Cincinnati, Ohio. But please do drop in there. Czech Republic, welcome. Another Pacific Northwest, some Texas, Colorado, Bengaluru, India, welcome. Quite a few US-based teams. Canada, Denmark, West Lafayette, Indiana. I am a Purdue grad, so welcome to the boiler, if you are indeed a boiler. Another Beaverton, Oregon. Our speaker here is from the Portland area. And for those just joining, welcome to today's webinar on decoding sufficient clinical evidence under EU MDR for medical devices. We'll give it about another 30 seconds here. For those just joining in, drop in the chat there if you haven't already where you're calling in from. We'd love to see it. See the boiler up. Appreciate that sentiment. So we've got a good number of people in here, Kara, so I'll probably kick it off here in a couple of seconds here. We'll give it another 10 seconds here. Switzerland, Croatia, welcome. Germany, welcome. Colorado, Wisconsin, more Czech Republic. Lots and lots of folks here from all around the globe. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Once again, today's webinar is on decoding sufficient clinical evidence under the EU MDR for medical devices. My name, by way of introduction, is Chris Rush. I'm a solutions engineer here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's session here is going to run for about 60 minutes, but we might stretch a little bit more depending on the amount of questions that we do get. Now, let me give you a short walkthrough of the interface that we're using here today. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a few tabs. Many of you have already found the chat tab. That's where you can engage with other attendees and post general comments. The Q&A tab is where you can ask questions that you want our presenter, Kara, here to answer during the Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. We may not be able to keep up with the questions if you're dropping them in the chat tab. So if you have a question you definitely want answered, be sure to submit it in that Q&A tab specifically. I'll be monitoring that on the side here as Kara is presenting, and we'll present those questions to the speaker, and hopefully we can get as many answered as we can here today. We will share the full recording and the slides with all of our registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye out for that email from us in the coming days. Now, I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. So improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you joining us here today. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in this heavily regulated industry. Our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so that you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru's MedTech suite provides quality management, product development, and clinical data management solutions, along with high-quality training and education designed exclusively for med device. See why over 1,200 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru by heading over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and seeing a personalized demo. Today's webinar is focused on decoding what sufficient clinical data means as stated in the EU MDR. At Greenlight Guru, we built a leading medtech toolbox for clinical data collection, specifically designed for medtech operations. Greenlight Guru Clinical is a single compliant platform for collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. If you're interested in learning more about this system and how it can help you streamline your clinical study, you can schedule a demo with us as well. Now, let's turn our attention to, I'm going to stop sharing this. Let's turn our attention to today's presenter, Kara Budor, Director of International Regulatory Affairs at MCRA. Kara has over 18 years of experience in medical device product development and regulatory affairs. And as the Director of International Regulatory Affairs, she specializes in international regulatory strategy, submissions, clinical evaluation, nonconformity, and additional information request responses. Before joining MCRA in 2021, Kara was the regulatory manager for a privately held orthopedic manufacturer where she led the regulatory department in the US and international regulatory strategy development and plan execution. She has been involved with clinical evaluation since the beginning of her career, and most recently has been supporting others in their related efforts through the EU MDD to MDR transition. So now for the part you've all been waiting for, the featured content of today's webinar. It's my pleasure to hand it over to our presenter. Take it away, Kara.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Chris. I appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like I've been working through clinical evaluation for a long time now, but I'm happy to be here to kind of talk through this maybe a little bit nebulous topic of sufficiency related to clinical evidence for EU MDR. So let's see here. Let's kind of start off with a few objectives. So in this presentation, a few things I want to cover here. We're going to start with some of the requirements and definitions in the MDR related to clinical sufficiency. There's an MDCG guidance, which gets a little bit more into those definitions, and then we can look at how it can be applied in our process. We'll go through some different considerations for when the evidence that you do have may not be meeting sufficiency related to quantity and quality. And then at the end here, we've got a number of issues that have come up during notified body review of a variety of device files. And so I kind of want to share what the team at MCRA has seen through that. So if we start at the beginning with our definitions, right away, this clinical evidence that we need to provide means the clinical data as well as the evaluation that goes around it. And you can see right away here sufficient amount and quality. So we're already talking about sufficiency being related to the quantity and quality of evidence. If we look at Article 61, it gets a little bit more into this, reiterating that we need to provide sufficient clinical evidence, but it's really on the manufacturer to specify and justify that level of clinical evidence. I guess some of the things that we get to consider in doing that relate back to the characteristics of the device and oftentimes the class of the device as well as its intended purpose. Article 61 gets into some situations describing, where clinical investigation may be needed, more for some of the higher risk devices, implantable devices, but also gives some situations where maybe you wouldn't be required to do a clinical investigation. But again, we go back to this idea of needing to have sufficient clinical data. MDCG 2020-6 was really developed with legacy devices in mind. There are a lot of questions around that. However, this guidance document provides some more information that we can use regardless of whether or not our device is legacy or not. And it's acknowledging that MDR does not define explicitly amount and quality of data that needs to be provided to show that your device is safe and achieves its benefits when used as intended. But it does also tell us that we need to follow a clinical evaluation process in order to get to that point. I'm not sure how helpful this slide is, but I will point out too that the guidance document speaks to the idea that the directives and MDR both require sufficient clinical data in terms of quantity and quality. It's really that the MDR has made this a more explicit requirement. And so if we look at the general safety and performance requirement, the first one here, we see that we need to demonstrate that the device benefit outweighs the risk. And I think risks are generally something that we can understand maybe a little more quickly, a little more quantitatively. There's adverse events that come up when using a device, or potential side effects, complications. So, I feel like we can speak to those pretty easily. Benefit, again, can be a little bit more gray. So then we can turn to the definition of clinical benefit in MDR, and noting that it has, there needs to be a positive impact of the device on the health of an individual. We can also look at the effects on public health. But the key terms to really take away from this definition are this meaningful, measurable, patient-relevant clinical outcomes. And so we're going to keep that in mind as we kind of look through the process that we're applying. I think the other thing to point out with GSPR 1 is this idea of taking into account generally acknowledged state of the art. So we're going to take that to our advantage here. So having looked at these requirements and definitions, if we're going to start in on this process of clinical evaluation, I think we can kind of start with some basic questions to answer. And so, just maybe being very, very down to basics here. Is the device safe? Does the device perform as intended? What is the clinical benefit? Does the benefit outweigh the risk? And is the device state of the art? But then also these questions about, well, are the conclusions that we're making based on enough data? And are the conclusions that we're making based on good enough data? And to me, those questions beget some other questions, and we need to find, well, what is state of the art before we can start to answer, is the safety of our device aligned with state of the art? Is the benefit and performance aligned with state of the art? And then is the benefit risk profile aligned with state of the art? We also need to answer, well, what is enough data and what is good enough data? And I think state of the art can help us with that, as well as some of the guidance documents that are out there. MDR also tells us that our clinical evaluation should follow a defined and methodologically sound procedure. And so the following slides that I have here are really to get after some ways to be methodical in how you go about collecting data, comparing data, setting basically these bars in this context for yourself in order to answer the questions that have been raised. So this slide here is really looking at the parameters that you're going to be looking at to arrive at some acceptability criteria. And so, toward the beginning, right, you kind of identify some key performance and safety parameters that are associated with the clinical benefit of your device, maybe the key functional specifications that it has, and some of the key risks. You also need to be able to have something that you can measure. And so associating your parameters with the things that you're going to, the data that you're going to collect. And there's a couple more slides to show some of these in an example form. That said, if you're picking out these parameters and these measures, we're going to have to justify why we're picking these ones. And this is really where state of the art comes into play, and why you need to be rigorous about it, because that research is going to help you justify why you're comparing what you're comparing. It's also going to help you identify your acceptability criteria, because we need to measure these things as qualitatively, but as quantitatively as possible as we can as well. And so determining some specific values based on state of the art is going to be key to making this work. So just a little bit more about state of the art and being methodical about it. So you'll conduct a literature search that's again, I keep probably saying the word rigorous, but you need to have a protocol that you can follow and repeat. There's going to be a data appraisal portion of that, and then a data extraction portion of that. And through that process, whether you are familiar with what is going on with similar devices or other treatments for what you're trying to address with your device, you'll understand kind of what is most current and relevant for what you're going to be comparing your device to in terms of outcomes and developing your benchmarks. And so this is how we can kind of link this state of the art to measurable and meaningful clinical outcomes for patients. As far as data extraction goes, I think there's some key things to keep in mind here. So after you've done your screening, right, you're going to look at your articles that you've collected for safety and performance data. You're going to be looking for some different alternatives. I think within state of the art. So sometimes, my background is orthopedics. I've spent a lot of time with those types of devices, but there's going to be, maybe some different devices that you can use to treat the same conditions. There might be some different therapies. You might have conservative therapies. So you kind of develop, what it is that maybe is most comparative to your device. Through your search, you're trying to be exhaustive, but also objective. And so including favorable and unfavorable data at this point is important to do. And that's why you kind of, almost become a machine if you get things set up correctly in order to kind of go through the data and keep what is needed. Some of the things that you'll end up keeping for your state-of-the-art analysis, and the next slide goes into a little bit more detail on this. Obviously, you need to reference your article, but collecting information on the study design and appraisal results so that we can speak to, at least on the state-of-the-art side, the quality of data that you're comparing to, as well as population characteristics, and then the safety and performance outcomes that are available to you. So just to get into maybe when you're collecting this data and using standardized methods. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Chris mentioned kind of the tool that maybe Greenlight Guru has access to. I've used spreadsheets. There's a number of programs out there. Some of them are using AI, and so you can collect this data in a variety of formats. But I think the main point is to be consistent with it, gathering the things that you need to know about your study in order to kind of stratify data later. Maybe just a quick tip in terms of when you're collecting data is to use consistent units so that we can help get to those acceptability criteria later. So this slide goes through an example and just throwing out there that they made up the data. So just don't pay attention to the numbers too closely here, but the idea being that if you have state of the art and you have, you're not really sure what parameters to use, it's a good place to kind of figure out what other people are using, what's available to you. You might already have in mind from data that you have on your device, what parameters are good and useful, or you're already planning or collecting data. So you can kind of keep that in mind as you're doing this. I will say though that, you do need to have outcomes that are comparable to those in state of the art. Otherwise, you may end up with having all this study data, but then nothing to really compare it to later. So keeping that in mind. But if we work our way through kind of how we go from a parameter to acceptability criteria, you might start with something On the safety side, like I've said, is maybe a little bit easier, but something like a revision or reoperation, adverse event associated. This example is for a disc replacement device in the spine. What you would be able to measure in terms of revision might be the rate of revision for something that's a performance parameter. We might be looking at improvement in pain, and so what we might be able to measure there, what we see in state-of-the-art literature to measure, would be an improvement in pain using a visual analog scale. And so we take that measure, and what we're hoping to be able to achieve with our clinical evaluation is, a lot of times with safety values, you want to have a lower rate of an adverse event. With performance, you want to have a greater improvement. But you're basically looking for those values of your subject device to be aligned with that of state of the art, or at least similar to, if not better than. So then we get to acceptability criteria, which is really where we make some quantitative values there. So again, for the safety parameter of revision as our example, we might say that our acceptable rate of revision is less than or equal to a certain percentage through a certain time point using your device. And just following this example a little bit more, so we do use the weighted averages at MCRA. I know there's a number of ways to do it. Other people look at ranges, and I think there's value to doing that. There can be some pros and cons. It kind of depends on maybe the risk level of your device, as well as how clear it is that your device is maybe meeting those requirements. You might need to get a little bit tighter on something that's a higher risk device, or it's not as clear that you're meeting the requirements. But suffice it to say, as you're going through this, you might find some different ways to look at the different parameters, and you might start to categorize the different options that are out there, different therapeutic or diagnostic options, which helps you later maybe in your discussion of the risk-benefit analysis in terms of how your device lands, kind of related to a target option versus maybe just some other alternatives that are out there. This slide here is just showing kind of an overview of the data and how you can compare subject device to state-of-the-art data. So this is just for the performance parameter of improvement in pain. From this slide, we can kind of see, okay, for this fictional subject device, maybe we have some pre-market data that puts it in a good light in terms of pain scores. We've got some other scores from some other studies that were done. I think what's missing here on this page is probably, for this device at least, patient numbers to help put in perspective how much data is here. But again, it's just kind of showing an overview of how you will end up being able to compare your subject device data to state-of-the-art in that risk-benefit analysis. So if we're kind of at the point of trying to understand, do we have enough data? The way we tend to approach that, if it isn't obvious, I mean, some folks are lucky enough to have, I think, a lot of data on their devices. Just they've been on the market for a long time. The outcomes they've collected on, there's a lot of information there. And so, let's say we don't have enough. How are we going to figure that out, or how are we going to justify whether or not we have enough? Really look at that state-of-the-art benchmark. And so for our example of revision reoperation less than equal to 3.2%, I mean, we can use that value to determine a sample size. And there's some text here. I mean, there's options in terms of how you want to compare your data. I think my recommendation is to, go find your favorite statistician and let them help you kind of figure out what is a viable way to compare your data to other state-of-the-art data that you've collected. And then, of course, if your sample size or the data that you have doesn't quite meet what you need, then we're at the point of needing to generate more data. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit there. So again, we put on our thinking caps as we do frequently with clinical evaluation. And what do we need to show? So I think one of the points here is that patient numbers might not be always the best way to look at sufficient quantity. I think maybe for the example that I gave of the spine disc replacement, it might be the right approach, but for a reusable device, if you have 20 patients using a reusable device multiple times a day, you might not need so many people in your study. So really going back to, okay, what is the device, how it's used. Another thing to think through in terms of quantity are all the indications that you want to covered. What about target population? So if you need to stratify your data based on a few different parameters, you got to think through, okay, do I have enough data for each of those stratifications that we need to kind of follow? And so if you're at the point of needing more data, or if you're at the point of, maybe you've gone through some of your appraisal, and we'll talk about some appraisal methods, but you need higher quality data. And there's a variety of ways to collect data, and we can go through a few different examples, but clinical investigation is a fairly resource intense way of collecting clinical data. So there are surveys, there's device registries. If you are lucky enough to have an equivalent device that you can justify, maybe there's some data there. But again, as you're thinking through quantity, don't forget, I think, what data you need to collect in terms of other populations and some of the biases on these different types of studies. So if you have a gap in sufficiency in terms of quantity, you can use any and all data. Like I said, just make sure you have enough to cover all of your indications, follow-up related device device lifetime, and then the outcomes that are described in state of the art. As far as a few of these different studies go, so registries might be a really good way to get a lot of data. But sometimes there are some holes in there, and so the quality of the data isn't always the greatest. For real world evidence, I think that can give you a really good idea of what's actually happening out there versus, clinical trials. Sometimes there's a lot of control to them, and so you may not capture all of the things that people are using your device. You may not capture all the information that is actually out there. Publications can look at extremes, good or bad cases. I think some people maybe are just morbidly curious or want to publish on really terrible things that happen, or maybe marketing pushes a company to publish something where everything looks great, lovely. But maybe it's not the true representation of the device. I'm sure many of you have ever heard do it right or do it again, but really is important to take the time to think through what is going to be justifiable based on your state-of-the-art research that you've done. Just a couple quick notes on off-label data. So off-label data, I would tend to include it, at least initially, because it goes to a couple of points. One, I think it shows that you've done an exhaustive search for your device, and can kind of maybe address the quantity side of having sufficient clinical data. It may be a little unethical to ignore some off-label data. It may be that off-label data also gives you an idea of some safety issues with your device, whether that's with labeling or design even. So some things to think through. When you do get to the appraisal side of things, you can look to maybe the performance side of things. And if a device wasn't used maybe per technique or per instructions, you may discredit some of that data. You just kind of have to approach it, I think, with an open mind, but also realistically in terms of what can be done and what you really should be using that data to indicate. I mentioned before that we can use this guidance document, so MDCG 2020-6. Like I said, it was built for maybe legacy devices initially, but at least at MCRA, we've got some feedback from some different notified bodies that some of the tools that are outlined or identified in there can be used in your justifications for all kinds of devices, not just the legacy devices. And so a couple things, and I'll point out a little bit more detail here, but understanding, level of clinical evidence. I think level of clinical evidence is mentioned in MDR, but it's not defined. And so this guidance document will give us some definitions of levels of evidence that we can use. It also gives some tools in terms of data appraisal, which you can use, again, to help justify that the data you are providing for your subject device is good enough. So Appendix 3 here provides a number of things. One gives a rank and definition of different levels of evidence. The little box that's highlighted in the middle there, so that's relative to legacy devices, and gives you an idea of, okay, you don't need to have this perfect randomized controlled trial to show that your device performs as intended and is safe and meets or is beneficial when it's used. So I would tend to take this, with maybe all of your devices in clinical evaluation and use it alongside maybe some appraisal methods to show that the evidence you're providing is good enough. I think the other thing you can do too is you probably have multiple sources of data, and so maybe not all of them are, at a certain level, but you can start to tell your story a little bit more. This is just an example of how we've taken advantage of that, Appendix 3. You can. This is a little bit loose here, but you can obviously take the example and maybe cater it to what you're doing. But here is a Class 3 high-risk device. It's an implant. It's resorbable. It's made out of bovine tissue, so there's a lot to question about it. But if we use this Appendix 3, we can see that, okay, well, these devices have been out on the market for a very long time. The standard of care and similar devices are also, very well understood risk-benefit profile. And so you can build out your justification there. We talked about some appraisal methods. So this IMDRF guidance document on clinical evaluation is probably the one that I've used the most and seen the most be used in terms of appraising your data for suitability and contribution. And you can use this for both your state-of-the-art and your subject device data. As far as maybe another little quick note on the state-of-the-art data. So you depending on what your device is, depending on what the landscape is out there, you may have a lot of data to sift through. And so you probably want to use the most, relevant data, but the highest level data, and kind of set the bar for yourself. Sometimes it takes a little bit of pilot searching, I think, to really land on what is going to be a good amount of data in terms of establishing state-of-the-art. I think I'll leave that at that. Maybe we're getting closer to the end of the presentation, but some watch outs here that are identified and that might undermine your justifications for clinical data sufficiency. So looking for bias in data sets for the data that you do have, or if you're going to do a new study, make sure that the study that you're pursuing kind of addresses these issues, or avoids some of these biases. Same with population. Make sure you're covering the target population you need to, and then just there's some other potential errors to kind of keep in mind. So that brings me to the list of deficiencies that we've seen at MCRA. I've kind of got them tallied over to the right here. We've seen, I don't know, hundreds of questions. So there's a lot of data to mine here. I will say that, these are questions compiled from all different stages of review. We have obviously helped some clients to make submissions, but also a lot of times we'll get pulled in when it's time to answer some questions at round one. And so some of these things I think are pretty easy to address right away. And, I would caution you to maybe provide a complete submission to begin with, and just avoid some of the easy things so you don't waste a round of questions on those. But that said, in terms of what we've found, literature seems to be kind of a main area of findings. Like I said, missing things is, those are things that can be included ahead of time. Exclusion of non-English articles. So this has come up a number of times for us. And I think in the, maybe spirit of gathering sufficient data in terms of quantity, if you find an article that's not in English and you can get it, I would have it translated. It gives you an idea of what is going on. Perhaps, when you go to appraise it, it's not as, it doesn't appraise as high. So maybe the contribution of data wouldn't come out there, but something to keep in mind there. I would not exclude, especially subject device articles, just because they're not in English. In terms of inadequate or inconsistent search terms or benchmarks. So search terms, I've seen a few examples where the search was way too focused. If you have a bone void filler, maybe that there's other options. There's bone grafts or bone graft substitutes, so searching for some of these other terms. If there's similar devices that I would include similar devices in your search terms for state-of-the-art. For subject device, if things have changed from manufacturer to manufacturer, keep that in mind. Common misspellings of device names. I know people like to be creative in that, so making sure you kind of capture data there. As far as some of the issues with the clinical investigations and subject data that we've come across, so insufficient data or short-term data. So insufficient data really maybe around coverage of indications or target populations. Sometimes you need to just get into the weeds and stratify things a little bit more to show that you've got everything covered. Short-term data, a lot of devices, have a functional lifetime, and so people have maybe data that shows that it's meeting safety and performance criteria kind of right off the bat or right when it's used, but then something that's maybe a permanent device or resorbable device, what happens later? Are there maybe safety events related to biocompatibility or permanent implantation that just need to be explained a little bit there. Not meeting benchmarks or state-of-the-art based criteria has come up a few times, and we kind of went through the process of how we could get there and address that. Missing analysis of clinical data and clinical evaluation create, I guess, the clinical evidence. So you can't just throw your data down and then have your reviewer kind of try to come to the same conclusions as you. So go through the analysis, connect the dots, make it easy for everyone to understand what's happening and support your conclusions. I think as far as insufficient clinical evidence goes, these are some common findings across a number of notified bodies. We've worked with a variety of notified bodies. Does seem to come up more maybe for legacy devices than new devices. And I think, that might be a function of people just, wanting to take advantage of what data they already have, or, maybe resting on their laurels of something having been previously certified. So, don't take that for granted. Go through the exercise to show that you have the data that is needed. And then, use the guidances, use the different tools available to explain, when and where it's appropriate to provide certain types or levels of data. As far as addressing some of these deficiencies, I guess I kind of covered a lot of this already in the prior slide there, but just, really being rigorous about your process and your method. I think a note on the documentation that you're provided. So the clinical reviewers and the technical reviewers are not always the same people. They're going to need a little bit of information on each subject in order to kind of come to their own conclusions. So some of the data just needs to be replicated. It's a little bit hard sometimes to point, everyone from your clinical evaluation to your technical documentation. So some of it make it easy for them to understand what you want them to understand, and then just keeping things consistent. So if you've got labeling in particular with intended purpose, indications for use, copy and paste that. Don't try to reword it in all these different places, because then nobody knows what you're trying to achieve there. Just an example of maybe one deficiency related to indications. So we are seeing that sometimes in order to get legacy device certified to MDR, reducing the scope is one way to do that. So just a very quick example is a device that was CE marked in the late 90s. It was available or indicated for use in all joints, but they really only had sufficient clinical data to demonstrate use in the knee and the ankle. And so the approach there was to limit the indications to kind of keep moving forward and gain that CE mark. So in summary, that was a lot, but basically sufficient means quality and quantity. So address both sides of that. In terms of quantity, we need to make sure that that's statistically driven and justified. There's a few options for doing that, as we saw. And then in terms of quality, think through what you need, and then also look at, appraisal and justification for level of evidence. Just noting that a randomized controlled trial is not always the right option for what you need to do. There's some other things out there that will get you what you need. And then as far as your data sets and any future study design, just be mindful of the watch outs that are out there. And then at the end of the day, if you have a clinical evaluation process that's methodological, objective, and clear, you're well on your way. Tell your story of your evidence. It's based on state of the art. And then sufficiency itself is also based on state of the art, as well as there's some guidance and other tools out there for you. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to now take some questions. I did put my contact information on this slide, as well as that for Brooke Alsfeld. She's a business development person at MCRA, but she could help kind of share some of the questions or find the right people to answer them if I'm not able to answer them now.
Excellent, Kara. Thank you so much for the presentation. The Q&A has really lit up throughout the course of the presentation here. So I'm going to start sharing some of the questions that have come in here. The first one here, I'm going to share, what is an example of accepted qualitative parameter? I've experienced that the notified body refuses to accept anything qualitative.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and have encountered some similar situations. I think one example that comes to mind the most is maybe there are quantitative measures out there, but everyone reports them in different ways. And so it's hard to kind of compile that data and present a single quantitative parameter. And so what we did there is, the best that we could is march through the various quantitative parameters that do exist, or do some translation for the reviewer in terms of, if you have something qualitative, how is it, how are some ways that you can make it quantified? So wound healing, I guess, comes to mind for me as something that's maybe not super well defined, or there's different aspects to it. So can you break it down into things that you can quantify? Or if it is truly, well, I would still say if it's qualitative, like how can you go about getting data on something that is a qualitative characteristic of your device?
Excellent. I'm going to fire through these questions here, Kara, kind of rapid style here. So
Sure.
let me mark that one as answered here, and let's march right along here. There's been several questions coming in, and I'm going to share this one here, related to use of data from certain regions of the world as pertains to the EU MDR. So here's one from Joe. Is there anywhere in the EU MDR that restricts use of US patient data for PMCF as long as it is fit for purpose with proven relevance and reliability? There have been additional questions as certain regions, is that applicable? Does it need to be in certain geographies?
Yeah, so, and I'll just, right off the bat here, I don't have MDR or these guidance documents memorized. I think maybe some of my colleagues do, but I'm going to answer from kind of practical experience on a lot of these. I think for this one, so far I've not hit any big issues with using data that's collected outside of the EU. I think you do have to be prepared to again, justify and defend maybe how the data that you're providing is useful or shows what needs to be shown. And that maybe goes back to, like, okay, are the patient demographics comparable? Let's see, demographics really comes to mind for me. But there's some other guidance documents that are out there that kind of go through, okay, what are some of the things to compare in order to, justify what you're doing. I think standard of care is another one. So in different regions, maybe there are different procedures that are followed, if you're in the EU versus in the US, and that's come up a couple of times. And, go back to maybe your state of the art and really try to work through, how is the data maybe different or not different from what you have. But I don't see limitations as long as you can justify comparable data.
Yeah. Next question here from Sarah. Where is the line between having enough data to confirm safety performance and being able to follow up with PMCF, and then just simply not having enough to get to market?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've seen that, I think maybe with devices that have, data on kind of this functional lifetime, but then maybe not as much data on something later. And so I think at the beginning, you still need to, statistically justify that your data is enough to detect maybe adverse events or performance outcomes. So, I would tend to look to developing my statistical justification based on state of the art in order to kind of say, okay, I've met this initial threshold for the safety and performance parameters that I've identified are relevant for my device. Something that maybe is a functional device life versus something that lives for a long time. Maybe with PMCF you can utilize that to kind of look at longer term outcomes. I think it's MedDev 2.7.1 is another good thing to look at in terms of what are the open questions aside from confirming safety and performance. And there's things in there about, if you have an innovative device, or if you have data collected and you're generalizing it, maybe you can kind of argue that you have enough data to get you to CE marking, and then PMCF to look at more I guess, different target populations. There's a whole list of things to kind of go through for that.
Great. Thank you for that. The next question here relates to acceptability criteria from, I believe, Lorena. How do you determine the acceptability criteria? Is it the mean value in the state of the art, a range, min to max, the max rate reported?
Yeah, so yeah, fair enough. So a lot of times when we're collecting data, we'll go ahead and collect all three of those values, but then when we put the acceptability criteria in, we will use the mean to weighted average value across state of the art, usually within a particular therapeutic or diagnostic option. We also report the range so that, if you're not right or it's not obvious that you are meeting that threshold value, there's a little bit of room for discussion. We've also done some meta-analyses, so where we look at variation of data compared to, I guess, between the subject device and state of the art. And so, maybe the means of the populations aren't, equal, but you can kind of explain, where things stand in that regard too.
Yeah, and then in terms of this, may be a maybe follow-on question to an earlier thought. Sarah's asking if the device is novel, therefore not a lot of real-world evidence. What is a good approach for compiling the CER? I think you might have mentioned that MedDev 2.7.1, but any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll go back to maybe another idea or thought that I had and didn't cover in this presentation. So, there are some devices out there that are new and unique and trying to treat something in a different way that maybe isn't treated already. And so, you can make the case for something meeting an unmet clinical need, still go through this state of the art research and identify, okay, if this is a new device and it's treating something that's not usually treated or treated in a way that, the outcomes are just not that great, I think you can still make this argument and still set some acceptability criteria based on your device. And so, and again, if it's that novel and if it's high risk, you may end up having to do a clinical investigation. So you just need to think through, I think, what is the bar, or set the bar for yourself to achieve.
Yeah. And then here's a question from Marianne. Kara, we have lots of questions coming in. We may not have time for all of them here, but I'll keep on going through.
Yep.
I'm trying to prioritize for all the attendees, those that have been upvoted with the thumbs up. So if there are any in particular that the attendees would like to see, go ahead and upvote those with a thumbs up within the Q&A section. Marianne's asking, how does one rationalize the use of data on similar products?
Yeah, so as far as similar products go, I mean, these are devices, they're not equivalent to your device, right? They're part of state of the art. And so using that state of the art data really can't do for your subject device, especially when it's a high class device. I've seen some lower class devices, class 1 instruments that are used all over the place. And I think, there you can argue that there's a pretty good understanding of the safety benefit profile of those devices. So in that way, I think you can maybe leverage some of the similar device data. I think the other thing too is, don't forget that there's this maybe performance-based route toward clinical evaluation. And so if you do have a device that's lower class or lower risk device, there's some different options in terms of putting together an argument where you don't need to rely on safety and performance data, clinical data. You can use non-clinical data for that.
And the next question here, this is related to your slide on the deficiencies. That I believe it's the list of the deficiencies with kind of the frequency. Maybe a quick answer here. Which notified body did this come from?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember. We've worked with a ton of different notified bodies. I mean, obviously, like BSI and TUV come up because I think they're kind of the big ones, but there's some smaller ones, and I don't know why they're not coming to mind at the moment. But I want to say that questions have come from, at least 5, but probably more notified bodies.
Yeah, excellent. And this is maybe outside the scope a little bit of today's presentation, but is there a similar guidance to MDCG 2020-6 for FDA submissions?
I don't know. I just don't know how to answer that question. Well, I don't know the answer is how I'm answering the question.
That is totally fair. Um, let's keep on marching along here. Okay, I'm trying to sift through the ones that I believe we've maybe already answered. Um, let's do this one's been upvoted a couple times. Lengthy question here, but let me read through it from Raj. Notified bodies are completely ambiguous on the required amount of investigational clinical data that will be sufficient for a pursued indication. This is incredibly frustrating for startup med device companies with investigational devices that have limited or no pre-existing clinical data to quote unquote fill the gap. So how do we as sponsors design an investigational clinical trial that meets MDR without any guidance? Do we just assume the most rigorous review scenario and do a $3 to $5 million RCT?
Yeah, so how to handle that? I mean, if I was this person, I definitely would be asking for help from people that have gone through this process, because it's not a new one. It is frustrating that the bar is not clear. On the other hand, if there was a very specific bar set, it might be too high to meet because it might be set like extremely conservatively. So there's probably some creative options. I think you do have to be open to the idea that if you do have a novel device, you do need to be able to collect some data on it, and there's different ways to do that. I think for better or worse, if your device is on the market in other places, that maybe the burden to get it there isn't as high. Maybe you can be doing a pre-market study somewhere else, and then bring that data in, as we talked about a little bit before, to help support your MDR application.
Next question here. I think you've answered, Curtis, here, but for use of foreign paper studies, does standard of care in that country matter? I think the answer is yes. Standard of care in certain geographies does matter. Kara, do you wish to comment briefly on that?
Yeah, and for this type of approach, I mean, maybe it goes back to your device a little bit, and it does. I don't know, specific devices are probably more variation in standard care than others, and so maybe I just haven't encountered as many devices where it matters as much. But definitely something to keep in mind when you're going about your justifications.
Okay, thank you. And this may be, you may be able to provide a kind of a broader answer to this question, but how narrow the population has to be. For instance, neuromotor diseases may be a category of subjects to consider. So I guess specific patient populations, I'm not sure I fully understand, but Kara, if you do, please comment.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with neuromotor diseases specifically, but I will say that you do need to look at your target population, just because they may have some different characteristics that affect how the device does perform. Maybe something to consider too is your list of indications. How much overlap is in that list of indications? In your population, some things you're treating. I'm just thinking like orthopedics, a bone fracture versus a fusion across joints. I mean, there's some different things to consider there. And then, adding in some sort of disease state. If it's contraindicated, you might really think through if you have a study and it's showing the results for a population that is contraindicated, you might have to appraise that a little bit lower. And so how narrow does the population have to be? I would take a little bit of time to understand, maybe how things are categorized, how you want to categorize them, but then also how state of the art kind of categorizes things.
Okay, excellent. And I'm just confirming we're getting right on time here. I'm just confirming that it's if this is going to stay open here. We'll plan to. I've got a couple more questions here, Kara. I'll share this next one. Hopefully, it doesn't cut us off in 23 seconds here. I don't think it will. Um, this one's from Hamid Reza. How do you produce sufficient clinical data for an exempt device for which clinical investigation is exempted? This may be more in your realm. Orthopedic fixation screw that is being marketed for the first time. This means that there is no PMS data on it.
Yeah, so exempt doesn't really have a definition with MDR, I think is the first thing that I would say to this. So it is an implant device. That said, it's a well-established technology, so you can use that MDR Article 61. There's some different explanations in there in terms of when clinical investigation would be needed. You still need clinical data of some kind on it. You can use post-market surveillance data, but as we go back to that MDCG guidance, that level of evidence is probably a little bit too low for something that is a class 2B implantable. So you can do a few things. One, if you're on market in another market, you can collect data there. You can look toward maybe seeing what is available in the literature that's been published. It sounds like this might be a new device, so that probably won't work. Maybe you have an equivalent device that is, you have a prior generation screw that you could take advantage of data there. But yeah, so there's a few different options. Again, it kind of just depends on maybe your specific situation.
Cool. And Kara, just to make sure, are you okay going these few minutes over that we are? I don't want to make sure.
Yeah, no problem.
This next question, this is a software AI type of question, a little bit outside of my realm, from Alejandro. Can you comment on Article 610 in terms of medical device software, particularly products that include AI when it is perhaps not possible to gather clinical data? How do you go about clinical evaluation in such cases? And if this is not within your realm, totally fair, but I wanted to propose that software AI is certainly a hot topic these days.
Fair enough. And I guess I would question, like, why is clinical data why is it not possible to gather this data? Maybe it's not that you can collect data in a post-market fashion. Maybe it's a pre-market fashion, but there's different ways to set up, I think, different clinical studies. And depending on what the device is, what the software is doing, is it a diagnostic software? Is it something that's helping with therapeutics? So there's a little more digging, I think, to do here in order to answer this question. But I think there's a way.
And that's a good answer for me. I've certainly picked something up at least. So question here from Harshada: how can we decide if the, and I'm going to try and hash through a little bit of the language barrier here, perhaps. How can we decide if the follow-up period for the study is enough to justify benefit risk for the device, like how the criterion differs for trauma and a hip implant? So length of follow-up, how is that kind of determined?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So I think there's a couple things that'll help. One, state of the art does help in terms of you're probably collecting some data on the different alternatives. You can look and see, like, okay, how long have these studies been conducted that other people have done? Something like a hip implant, there's registries out there, so that it's going to give you probably an answer. There's a lot of data that could be followed up on. I think for some device classes, there may be some panel feedback that's available, at least at MCRA, that we could look into to kind of help guide maybe some of those answers to those questions where it's not clear. But that might be for devices that are pretty well established out there. So I think there's a couple ways to look at it, and then really understanding what your device is intended to do and its device life. That's where I would start.
And well, maybe a question or two more here, including this one here from Robert. Are clinical data needed to support a Class 2A device that was cleared by FDA on a 510K with extensive, well-documented non-clinical data, but no clinical data?
So you need to cross out the part where it says cleared by FDA on 510K, because I don't think it really matters when it comes to MDR there's not necessarily reference country clearance exceptions. So then the question is, our clinical data needed to support a class 2A device with well-documented non-clinical data, but no clinical data. So I think then you are looking at, okay, what are the exceptions to, performing this clinical data route for clinical evaluation? Maybe you can rely on a performance route. Class 2A, you're starting to get maybe a little more risky device. And so I think you really need to identify, I guess go back to state of the art. What are other people doing? And if the device is being used maybe alongside something that's higher class, like can you use that as surrogate data? So I don't know the answer to this question. I think it kind of depends on the situation, but there might be different ways to approach it.
And this is a lengthy question, but I heard a similar question at a conference last week from Claudia here. Many devices are enabling devices like guide wires, for instance. Their technical success enables certain procedure to occur, but the benefit to the patients is measured by the procedure itself. For this kind of device, there are many publications where the device was successfully used, but this is not directly measurable with any endpoints in the articles rather than overall procedural success, which of course depends upon many things. What would be a good way to collect direct quantitative endpoints for such an enabling device like a guide wire, et cetera?
Yeah, so there are a few thoughts coming to mind here. So there's a section in that MDCG 2020-6 guidance that talks about indirect clinical benefit relative to clinical benefit. And so I think I want to say GuideWire might have been even one of the examples in there, but you can look at maybe data related to what that guide wire is supporting as, again, kind of surrogate data or, an indicator of how successful that guide wire is as part of maybe a system or as part of an overall procedure. So you can kind of look toward what else is the device being used with to answer that question. Yeah, I think I'll leave it with that, but there are some ways there, and that would be one way to do that.
And then here from Alice, if a device has several indications, can our overall sample size be divided between indications to demonstrate the performance and safety of the device for every one of the indications? So proving one, allowing for demonstration of all.
Yeah, and I'd say yes, it can. A lot of people try to avoid doing that, but I think we have some good examples of where that didn't work out very well. So I would say, I guess, sorry, I think maybe I'm misreading the question, because you're saying, like, can your overall sample size, like if you had a performance parameter and you had to show that, I guess that your device, whatever, you have that much data kind of using your device, I would say pursue determination of sample size for each indication. So if you have, I don't know, go back to this other question, a trauma versus restoration indication or something. Maybe that's not the best example, but look at what your sample size needs to be to kind of address each of those individually.
And quick thought there from my experience in the vascular world, indication up to a certain length was what the study was demonstrating for one of the vascular stents that I was working with. The shorter sizes were just uncommon, so the longer sizes were more typical. All those sizes were approved through that study. When that particular device went for very long length indication, additional study was needed for that. So maybe it just depends.
Yeah.
Really specific question here. I'm gonna cut this off here, Kara. I don't want to keep us here too long. Seeing the numbers dropping off a little bit here, so I want to make sure we're respectful of time. This is a really specific question. Article 61 6B mentions common specifications. Where can I find these? Do they exist for sutures, staples, etc.? And this may be, and I don't know, but I'll pose the question.
Yeah, fair enough. As far as I know, there haven't been any common specifications published yet. I could be wrong, but I don't think that there are any yet. And I think those are published by the commission. So I'd probably be looking around that area on the web.
Yeah, excellent. Well, with that, I'm going to close the Q&A section. We got to most of the questions. There were a few that seemed to have some crossover, specifically like the geographical region types of questions. I want to thank Kara, you for the informative presentation and the valuable insights that you gave here during the Q&A portion. As one final reminder for attendees here, today's recording and the presentation slides will be sent to you via email in the following days here. So I want to thank all of you for attending today's presentation, Kara for the presentation here from your ends, and have a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon.